Nirvana's former manager claims that Kurt Cobain was murdered are ridiculous. He killed himself. On March 25, 1994, Nirvana's former manager Danny Goldberg joined 9 other people at 171 Lake Washington Boulevard in Seattle to beg for Kurt Cobain's life. They had all been invited. Glassy-eyed, increasingly angry and feeling you in love's words you ganged up on, Cobain wouldn't crack. He insisted he was in a bad way, says Goldberg, fresh from reliving the experience in his new book on managing Nirvana, Serving the Servant. The main memory I spoke to him on the phone when I got home and talked to him one last time. I couldn't shake him out. In fact, the intervention did have the desired effect, albeit briefly. On March 30, like those that took JFK, Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lennon, it was a shot that echoed around the world. As serving the servant, it's that combination of darkness, idealism, humor, compassion, cynicism, Goldberg argues. The totality of it, serving the servant, paints Cobain as a deeply conflicted character. He could be kind, and Cobain was determined to leave the independent Seattle label Sub Pop, which had released their debut album Bleach in 1989, and record their second album on a major, opting for Geffen, home of their scene mentors Sonic Youth. As a fan of both, he had this borderline obsessive focus on his art, he says. He was completely inside a year of taking the band on. Goldberg had a phenomenon on his hands. Smells Like Teen. There's an impression from the book that, though Cobain always planned to be a major rock icon, he struggled with it happening so fast. Once Smells Like Did he change after Nevermind knocked Michael Jackson off the US #1 spot? No, he was. Goldberg's book is sympathetic towards the splashdown of love in Cobain's upended world. He fell in love. This wasn't a transient rock and roll fling but a deep connection, but recognizes that the sudden presence of a strong-minded, enormously talented artist in her own right and an enormously complicated person in the Nirvana camp at such a pivotal time shifted the dynamic. After several years, had heard reports, but Goldberg first noticed Cobain withdrawn and barely able to stay conscious after an appearance on Saturday Night Live in January 1992. The next day, Cobain's sporadic addictions were a tangled psychological web. There was part of him. Danny separates 3 stages of Cobain into before Nevermind, the immediate aftermath and the dark side. The final 2 years, he took the anguish he was feeling and the unresolved issues about custody of his daughter and the embarrassment of the way he and Courtney had been depicted and turned it into this performance art, Goldberg remembers. Being pushed on indeed, at the same time that the band were humorously baiting one-time fan turned arch-nemesis Axl Rose into an abusive tantrum at the 1992 VMA Awards, they were also taking a serious and uncompromising approach to third album In Utero. Inspired by the sheer success of Nevermind made it by definition commercial, Goldberg argues. Kurt was conscious when Cobain asked Scott Litt to remix the album's singles Heart-Shaped Box and All Apologies to bring his buried vocals to the fore. Albini attacked Nirvana's team in the press as manipulative and parasitic. Every single other person involved in that band's career was a piece of shit, he said. There are people who were. He's a good self-promoter, Goldberg retorts. I admire some despite its clear intention to see off the brainless jock element of Nirvana's audience, the sort of guys that would been beating the band up in high school. In Utero sold in its millions in 1993. Yet Goldberg he watched Cobain's final downward spiral as a close associate, friend and advisor. His repeated it's ridiculous, he asserts. He killed himself. Shortly before his death, Goldberg confesses, Cobain had asked him if he might be able to launch a career outside of Nirvana. Had even arranged. It's all too easy to fantasize about the music that a major rock star didn't live to make, but Cobain's legend is rooted in far more than simply dying young. In his few short, Goldberg, too, sees Cobain alongside the true legends of music. He's one of the great. His fondest memory? Goldberg doesn't. I keep coming back to thinking about his smile, he says. There was something related
Raindrop, drop top smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park, pot.